Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the right to strike in Canada and two recent examples. Now, Michael, the public sector, the PSAC or public sector workers strike, that obviously was a public sector strike. And WestJet, if they had gone on strike, that would have been a private sector strike, although in a federally regulated industry. What can you tell me about the main differences between strikes in the public sector versus the private sector? One of the examples in the last segment you raised was the role of back to work legislation. What other differences are there?
Well, the general flow of how these roll is broadly very similar. The two differences that come to my mind, one is this power imbalance that governments can legislate and force an end to the dispute and impose terms, and no private sector employer can do that. So they approach it in a very different way from a legal test and a fairness of test for the public. The other difference, I guess, is in the private sector, usually the target of negotiations is one firm in an industry, one car company out of three, one airline out of several, one mining company, and their competition is going to continue working. So that company is very vulnerable to losing customers and market share and can be under acute pressure pretty quickly. And then what you get is sort of pattern bargaining across an industry as tables work from place to place. Public sector is a much broader set of negotiations across a whole bunch of organizations, and in the federal system, it's been roughly once every 4 or 5 years. You kind of reset the terms and conditions and wages for a large number of organizations all at the same time.
Danica, anything you want to add about that? One of the things that stands out to me as the difference that kind of Michael touched on is in the private sector, the company can just close up their doors and leave and relocate to another jurisdiction. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, that is definitely another difference. A third difference, maybe to point out too, and Michael touched on it briefly, is with WestJet, for example, it would be the pilots on strike. That is one group of employees who have very similar interests. With the federal government strike, the PSAC strike recently, you had a very broad group of employees making, there was a huge range of salaries. There was a huge range of working conditions, from people at the border to people at CRA, to people working on military bases. And so they have really different interests, which can make bargaining for that group of people very difficult.
Danica, one thing I want to ask you about is the role of replacement workers, and pejoratively, these are referred to as scabs. Not my term, but it's a term that is used. So, what exactly is the role of replacement workers? When can they be used legally and operationally? What are some of the practical challenges of replacement workers?
So replacement workers, from a very high level, will come in to do the work of striking employees. And replacement workers are sometimes hired temporarily, off the street. Sometimes a replacement worker will be an employee who's already working for the company, but in a different bargaining unit. And sometimes it'll be management gets asked to come in and step in and do some of those really critical roles in the bargaining unit that is going to allow the organization to continue operating. And so from a legal perspective, every jurisdiction is going to be a little bit different around their rules. The federal government has recently promised to introduce legislation banning replacement workers in federally regulated sectors. The impact of that really would be giving a lot more power to sort of the union side of that bargaining, because employers wouldn't have any ability essentially to continue operating during a strike using replacement workers. Practically speaking, when they get used is when the company or the organization feels they can keep operating through the strike. For WestJet, for example, that wouldn't really be a practical case because there aren't a lot of qualified airline pilots sitting at home waiting to get a call asking if they want to come work for a couple days or a couple weeks. So you really have to look at the industry to see, are there qualified workers that could get replacement?
Michael, anything you want to add to the role of replacement workers in these industries?
Well, I think the use of replacement workers is an escalation. It often raises the sort of, the anger and the mood around strikes. So it has led to violence in the past and miners' strikes and rail strikes and so on. So it's not a tool which employers would want to use lightly.
Right.
And they often try to get by with managers and the rooted workers.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.